General Custer stands atop a hill, hat raised, smiling at what he believes is certain victory. "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." But he doesn't know he's looking down on the largest Native American camp ever assembled. Within an hour, all his men will be dead, and his name forever tied not to glory, but to disaster. George Armstrong Custer was never meant to be ordinary. Born in 1839 in the small town of New Rumley, Ohio, he was the son of a blacksmith and part-time farmer. Even as a child, George was driven by a hunger for greatness. He was loud, defiant, and bold, qualities that often got him into trouble, but also hinted at the man he would become. Custer believed, even as a boy, that destiny had something larger in store for him. In 1857, he entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. There, his need for attention and rebellious nature flourished. He broke rules constantly, accumulating 726 demerits, more than any cadet before him. He was a class clown, prankster, and relentless flirt. But despite his chaos, his instructors and classmates couldn't deny his raw potential. There was something magnetic about him. He was clever, fearless, and charismatic. Custer graduated last in his class in 1861, not exactly a promising start. But as fate would have it, the country was plunging into civil war. Suddenly, even the bottom of the class would be sent to the front lines, and for Custer, the battlefield was the stage he had always dreamed of. He was first assigned to cavalry duties and quickly made a name for himself through sheer audacity. Where others hesitated, Custer charged. He led from the front, sword raised, golden hair flying behind him. This bravery, or recklessness, depending on who you asked, made him stand out. Soldiers wanted to follow him, and commanders began to take notice. He craved not just victory, but legacy. Every move he made was with an eye on the history books. Custer wanted to be remembered, not merely as a soldier, but as a legend. He dressed flamboyantly, with a custom uniform and bright yellow neckerchief. To some, it was vanity. To Custer, it was branding. As the war escalated, so did Custer's role in it. He would not remain obscure for long. Even among the officers, Custer had a way of standing out, sometimes as a charismatic leader, other times as a polarizing figure. His methods were unorthodox, and he seemed more interested in dramatic charges than careful planning. But success often shielded him from criticism. His boldness paid off again, and each triumph fueled the myth of the fearless young general. Yet his rapid rise also earned him envy and resentment. There were whispers that Custer was more performer than commander, more lucky than brilliant. His enemies at court and in the army accused him of self-promotion, of caring more about headlines than strategies. But Custer brushed it all off. He believed that boldness was its own kind of genius, and caution was the refuge of the mediocre. By 1862, Custer had already seen more battle than many officers a decade older than him. He seemed born for war, drawn to it like a moth to flame. Whether he would burn out or blaze a trail into history, no one yet knew. But one thing was clear. America had found its most theatrical soldier. The American Civil War gave George Custer the opportunity to prove everything he believed about himself. It was his crucible, and he emerged from it forged in fire. In 1863, at the age of just 23, he was promoted to brigadier general, a meteoric rise that shocked the establishment but thrilled the public. The press dubbed him the boy general, and he leaned into the persona with every ounce of flair. Custer distinguished himself at the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most pivotal confrontations of the war. At a critical moment, with Confederate cavalry threatening the Union flank, Custer charged headlong into the enemy. His bold maneuver helped stall the Confederate advance and may have played a key role in preserving the Union position. He was lauded not just for bravery, but for tactical brilliance. This became a pattern. Custer wasn't content to sit back and plan. He needed to be in the fight. He led cavalry charges personally, his presence inspiring his troops to push beyond their limits. His men adored him, trusting him with their lives, and his enemies feared him, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of what he might do next. His fame grew. Newspapers chronicled his victories. Artists painted his likeness, Young boys across the country wanted to grow up to be just like him. For a time, George Custer was the face of Union cavalry success. He achieved what he had always wanted, to become a national hero. But glory has a price. The more Custer achieved, the more he felt invincible. The war gave him purpose, but it also fed his ego. His celebrity status made him a symbol of youthful valor, but also masked his growing sense of invulnerability. He began to believe that no battlefield could defeat him, that every challenge would bend to his will. His theatrics grew bolder, and so did his disregard for conventional orders. Custer became known for his wild charges and unrelenting aggression. His men would often follow him through hailstorms of gunfire simply because he demanded it. Some say he had a death wish. Others claimed he just wanted to die a hero's death. Yet the line between valor and vanity blurred with each campaign. He started choosing battles not just for strategic value, but for visibility. He was always chasing headlines, always needing the next great victory to remain relevant. That hunger never faded, even as the war neared its end. By the time Appomattox came and General Lee surrendered, Custer had not only made a name, he had crafted a legend. But legends don't rest easy. With the war over, the adoring crowds and newspaper columns couldn't offer the same adrenaline. He was left with a question no promotion could answer. What now? With the Civil War over, Custer found himself without a battlefield worthy of his talents. He was reassigned to the western frontier, tasked with leading the 7th Cavalry in what the government called the Indian Wars. For Custer, it was a bitter disappointment. He had faced legendary Confederate generals in the East. Now he was chasing bands of Native American warriors across endless plains. It felt beneath him. But ambition doesn't rest. Custer saw an opportunity to reclaim glory, even here. He approached his new mission with theatrical flair, determined to turn skirmishes into spectacles. Yet he quickly learned the West would not yield to him as easily as the South had. The terrain was harsh, the enemy elusive, and the cause far less noble. He wasn't liberating a nation. He was enforcing expansion. His early campaigns were brutal and controversial. In 1868, at the Battle of Washita, he attacked a Cheyenne village at dawn, killing over 100 people, many of them women and children. He called it a victory. Others called it a massacre. Worse, it turned potential allies into enemies and ignited cycles of revenge. But Custer didn't care. The headlines hailed him a hero once again, and that's all that mattered. Tensions grew not only with native tribes, but within his own ranks. His impulsiveness and thirst for fame caused friction with fellow officers. Men like Major Joel Elliott and Captain Frederick Benteen grew resentful of his recklessness. Still, Custer surrounded himself with loyalists, his brothers Tom and Boston, and brother-in-law James Calhoun. Together, they formed a tight inner circle, isolated from dissent. Custer's disdain for diplomacy and his preference for shock and awe tactics set him apart. He wasn't interested in treaties or peace councils. He wanted decisive action, dramatic outcomes. And the press played along. Each report of his raids and expeditions painted him as the frontier's lone avenger, pushing back the so-called savagery with heroic force. He fed that narrative because it fed him. Behind closed doors, however, his command was unraveling. Discontent spread among his men, not just because of his ambition, but because of the unnecessary risks he often forced them to take. Marches extended in brutal winter cold, assaults with little planning, and dismissive attitudes toward logistics and safety turned admiration into unease. Some began to question if Custer truly led for country or for his own myth. The Native American resistance, meanwhile, was uniting. Chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse watched Custer's movements closely. They understood what he represented, not just a general, but the symbol of an encroaching force that would not stop. Every attack hardened their resolve. As the 1870s wore on, Custer's reputation became a paradox. To the east, he was still the daring hero. To those who served under him, he was a dangerously arrogant man, obsessed with glory at any cost. And that cost was coming due. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was supposed to be a turning point. It promised peace, land, and autonomy to the Lakota Sioux, in exchange for staying within their designated reservation in the Black Hills. For the Sioux, it meant a fragile hope that their way of life could endure. For the United States, it was just another tactical pause in an unstoppable march westward. The Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota. Nestled in what is now South Dakota, they believed these lands were a gift from the Great Spirit, a place of ancestors and visions. The treaty was a compromise they never wanted but accepted under growing pressure. Chief Red Cloud had negotiated it, believing peace was preferable to endless bloodshed. But not all Sioux agreed. One man in particular, Sitting Bull, remained defiant. Sitting Bull saw through the illusion. He knew the white man's hunger could not be sated by ink on paper. The United States might promise peace, but its eyes glinted with gold, literally. In 1874, a military expedition led by none other than George Custer confirmed the presence of gold in the Black Hills. The news spread like wildfire. By 1875, thousands of prospectors swarmed into the region, trampling over treaty lines and Lakota territory. Washington responded with duplicity. Officially, the government claimed settlers were acting independently, beyond federal control. Unofficially, they encouraged the gold rush. When the Lakota protested, the U.S. government made one final offer: sell the Black Hills. Sitting Bull refused. "You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon, some hardtack, and a little sugar," he told the negotiators. The response from the U.S. was swift and brutal. President Ulysses S. Grant issued an ultimatum in late 1875. All native tribes not on reservations by January 31, 1876, would be considered hostile. It was a death sentence disguised as diplomacy. The order was delivered during winter, a time when travel was nearly impossible. Sitting Bull and many others saw it for what it was: a declaration of war. And so, the peace was broken, not by Lakota aggression, but by American greed. The treaty that once offered hope had become a symbol of betrayal. The Lakota were pushed into a corner, forced to fight for the very lands they had already been promised. The United States, blinded by gold and glory, was ready to crush anyone who stood in the way. George Custer and Sitting Bull could not have been more different. One was a golden-haired showman, hungry for recognition and etched into the imagination of Eastern newspapers. The other was a spiritual leader, grounded in tradition and revered among his people for wisdom and calm resolve. Their destinies were bound together, not by choice, but by the forces of empire, resistance, and fate. Custer lived for action. He thrived in noise, attention, and movement. He decorated himself in custom uniforms, posed for photographers, and welcomed reporters on his expeditions. To him, war was theater, and he was the star. Every campaign was a chance to craft his legend, to be remembered in songs and stories. His men both admired and feared his reckless bravery. He charged first, asked questions later. Sitting Bull, by contrast, was deliberate and deeply introspective. Born around 1831, he was Hunkpapa Lakota and grew up learning the ways of the hunt, the vision quest, and the spiritual path of his people. His name came from a moment of reflection during battle, when he calmly sat and watched arrows fly. It was a name that spoke to his soul, one of steadiness, not haste. He was more than a war chief. Sitting Bull was a holy man, a visionary who claimed to receive messages from the Great Spirit. These visions guided his people and earned him enormous respect. His leadership wasn't about charisma or theatrics, but about unshakable conviction. He believed the land was sacred, that it couldn't be sold or surrendered. His refusal to compromise made him a target, but also a symbol of defiance. The contrast between the two men reflected the larger conflict around them. Custer embodied the expansionist hunger of a young America, ambitious, restless, and unwilling to be denied. Sitting Bull stood for resistance, for the ancient rights of a people who had lived on the land long before America was conceived. They weren't just opponents, they were opposites in every sense. When their paths finally crossed, the tension was more than personal. It was historic. Custer, chasing one last heroic charge. Sitting Bull, seeking to protect his people from extinction. Both were convinced of the righteousness of their cause, and both would meet on the banks of the Little Bighorn. The winter of 1868 was brutal on the plains. For the native tribes, it meant vulnerability. For the U.S. Army, it meant opportunity. George Custer and the 7th Cavalry were dispatched to strike at hostile bands while they were weakened by the cold. Custer relished the assignment. It was his chance to restore his glory and deliver a headline-worthy victory. On November 27th, near the Washita River in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, Custer's scouts located a Cheyenne village. It was led by Chief Black Kettle, a man known for seeking peace with the United States. But Custer was not interested in peace. At dawn, he led a surprise attack. His men charged through the village, sabers drawn and rifles blazing. Chaos erupted. Over 100 Cheyenne were killed. Most were not warriors. Women, children, and elders fell under the gunfire. Chief Black Kettle and his wife were among the dead. Custer called it a successful engagement. The press agreed. Washington hailed him a hero. But the truth told a different story. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Worse, Major Joel Elliott, one of Custer's officers, had chased fleeing Cheyenne into the wilderness and never returned. Custer, fearing counterattack, chose to withdraw rather than wait. Weeks later, Elliott's body and those of his 20 men were found mutilated. Many in the cavalry blamed Custer for abandoning them. The consequences were long-lasting. Native resentment deepened. The attack shattered any remaining trust. Tribes that had once sought compromise turned to vengeance. The massacre at Washita became a rallying cry. Among those who took it personally was a young Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse. And Bloody Knife, Custer's future scout, never forgave the Cheyenne for what happened to Elliott. Custer's defenders argued he acted prudently, that staying would have risked even more lives. But his critics saw cowardice wrapped in vanity. For many, it marked the first crack in the Golden Boy's reputation, a moment when his hunger for fame outweighed his responsibility as a commander. The seeds of doubt began to sprout within his own ranks. Publicly, Custer continued to ride high on the wave of success. But privately, tensions simmered. Captain Frederick Benteen, in particular, became increasingly vocal in his criticism. His contempt for Custer's impulsive decisions, especially in moments like Washita, would echo years later at Little Bighorn. The 7th Cavalry was beginning to fracture, torn between loyalty and disillusionment. For the tribes of the plains, Washita was a thunderclap. It erased any illusion of peace. Resistance became survival. Stories of the massacre were told and retold, passed from campfires to councils. Children grew up hearing of the treachery of the long-haired general who attacked while they slept. For Custer, the Washita raid burnished his fame. For the Plains tribes, it was a declaration of total war. The seeds of Little Bighorn were sown not in a grand campaign, but in the blood-soaked snow of a quiet village at dawn. By the early 1870s, George Custer had grown restless. The Indian Wars had dragged on longer than anyone expected, and the glory he had once enjoyed in the East was fading in the shadow of national expansion. He needed a new mission, something grand, something unforgettable. The Black Hills Expedition of 1874 offered him exactly that. Officially, the U.S. government dispatched the 7th Cavalry to scout for a new fort location and to keep an eye on the Lakota. Unofficially, the mission's true purpose was clear: gold. Rumors of rich deposits in the Black Hills had circulated for years, and now Washington wanted proof. Custer, with his flair for spectacle and love of fame, was the perfect frontman. The expedition was massive and well-publicized. Custer brought photographers, journalists, and even a band to accompany his troops. The resulting reports were less like military dispatches and more like travelogues. Custer posed for photos, led extravagant hunting trips, and issued glowing descriptions of the land and its resources. It was less a campaign than a propaganda tour. When gold was indeed discovered, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Prospectors poured into the region by the thousands, despite the Fort Laramie Treaty explicitly prohibiting white settlement in the Black Hills. The U.S. government, rather than enforcing the treaty, turned a blind eye. The influx of miners was treated as an inevitability, not a violation. Sitting Bull and the Lakota watched in disbelief and growing anger. The sacred lands they had been promised were being overrun. Their protests were ignored. Their patience was tested. Once again, a piece of paper signed in good faith was shredded by the hunger for wealth. For Custer, the expedition was a triumph. The press adored him, politicians praised him, and his celebrity status soared. He had successfully blended exploration, exploitation, and ego into a single campaign. But beneath the celebration, tensions were boiling. Many within the military were uneasy about Custer's ambitions. His showmanship irritated other officers, and his willingness to use military missions for personal gain raised questions about his leadership. Yet none could deny that Custer had reignited public interest in the frontier, and in himself. As more settlers flooded into the Black Hills, conflict became inevitable. Custer had lit the fuse. All it needed now was a spark. The United States government made one last attempt at diplomacy, but it came with a deadline and a threat. In the fall of 1875, emissaries were sent to the Lakota with a simple proposition: sell the Black Hills. The answer was a resounding no. The land was not for sale, and the Lakota would not be moved. President Ulysses S. Grant, under pressure from gold interests and settlers, responded not with negotiation, but with force. He issued a harsh ultimatum. All Sioux and Cheyenne must report to reservations by January 31st, 1876. Any who did not comply would be considered hostile. It was winter. Travel was deadly. The demand was, in effect, impossible. Sitting Bull saw through the ploy. It wasn't about peace. It was about conquest. With his back against the wall, he chose resistance. He sent word to allied tribes, calling for a gathering of all who would not bow. Among those who answered the call were Crazy Horse and Gall, two of the fiercest warriors of their time. Together, they formed a massive camp, thousands strong, near the Little Bighorn. It was more than a resistance. It was a movement. The old ways, the ancestral traditions, the sacred lands, they would not be surrendered without a fight. The camp was not only a military stronghold, it was a cultural and spiritual stand. There, warriors trained, families gathered, and ceremonies were held. It was unity in the face of extinction. For once, disparate tribes stood as one. Meanwhile, Custer saw the moment he had been waiting for. Orders were issued for a three-pronged military campaign. Custer would lead his 7th Cavalry from the east, General Terry from the north, and General Crook from the south. The plan was to trap and crush the native forces. To Custer, this was destiny calling. He envisioned a swift victory, one that would restore his fading legend and perhaps launch a political career. He saw himself once more on the front page, hailed as the hero of the frontier. The stage was set, the roles were cast, and Custer was ready for his final performance. But the forces gathering against him were greater than he imagined. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were not scattered bands of raiders. They were united, determined, and ready. The warning had been given. The time for talk had ended. War was coming. In June 1876, as the campaign against the Lakota intensified, Custer made the decision that would seal his fate. He had been ordered to scout and wait. General Terry's instructions were clear. But patience was not a virtue Custer possessed. When his scouts reported a large native camp near the Little Bighorn River, he saw an opportunity for glory. Rather than wait for reinforcements, Custer divided his 700 men into 3 columns, one under Major Reno, another under Captain Benteen, and the final one under his own command. His plan was to strike from multiple angles, catch the enemy by surprise, and drive them into retreat. It was bold. It was reckless. The problem was scale. Custer believed he was facing perhaps 800 warriors. In reality, the camp held over 2,000. His intelligence was flawed, his assumptions fatal. As his men crept into position, they realized too late they were outnumbered, outflanked, and isolated. Custer sent a desperate message to Benteen. "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." But Benteen never arrived in time. Reno's forces were already retreating under heavy assault. Custer and his 210 men were left alone, surrounded on a ridge that would later be called Last Stand Hill. Custer's men fought bravely, but stood no chance. One by one, they fell. No one survived to tell the full tale. Their bodies were found days later, stripped, mutilated, and silent. The sounds of battle had echoed across the plains, and the rising smoke was visible for miles. When General Terry and his forces arrived days later, the scene was apocalyptic. Scattered corpses, burned debris, and the haunting absence of survivors. Even among hardened soldiers, the sight of Custer's remains and those of his fallen men left a profound silence. The shock reverberated beyond the battlefield. News of the defeat spread like wildfire across the United States. The country that had expected another tale of triumph was instead met with tragedy. The myth of Custer, the untouchable warrior, had shattered in a single afternoon. The blame game began immediately. Some accused Reno and Benteen of cowardice or incompetence. Others condemned Custer for his hubris. The debate raged in newspapers, military circles, and the halls of government. Everyone had an opinion. No one had answers. For Native Americans, the victory was both a triumph and a warning. They had defended their land and people with courage and unity, but they knew retaliation would follow. Sitting Bull and the others did not celebrate long. The storm they had delayed was still coming. The golden boy of the Union, the star of the frontier, had made the mistake of his life, and he paid for it with everything. As Major Reno crossed the Little Bighorn River, he believed he was catching the southern edge of Sitting Bull's village by surprise. What he did not know was that the village was far larger than expected, sprawling for miles and sheltering thousands of warriors, women, and children. His charge began in confusion and ended in chaos. The attack was supposed to be coordinated with Custer and Benteen. Instead, it became a fragmented mess. Reno's men dismounted and formed a skirmish line, trading shots with Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, who quickly mobilized to repel the invaders. Then came the counterattack. Spearheaded by Crazy Horse and Gall, the native warriors struck with terrifying force. They fought not just with weapons, but with fury born of betrayal and survival. Bloody Knife, Custer's Arikara scout, tried to calm Reno, but a bullet took his life mid-sentence. His blood and brains sprayed across Reno's face, shattering the Major's already fragile resolve. Panic spread. Reno called for a retreat. One so disorderly it barely qualified as one. Soldiers dropped weapons, abandoned horses, and scrambled across the river under a hail of arrows and bullets. The retreat turned into a rout. Reno and a few surviving men scrambled up a bluff, bloodied and broken. Benteen, whose column had been delayed, arrived in time to witness the wreckage. He and Reno regrouped atop what became known as Reno Hill. There they entrenched themselves, surrounded, outnumbered, and uncertain of Custer's fate. Gunfire could be heard from the north, the sound of Custer's final stand, but no help could be sent. For nearly 2 days, Reno and Benteen's men held their position, repelling repeated assaults. Ammunition dwindled, water was scarce, and morale was collapsing. Only the approach of General Terry's column on the evening of June 26th forced the native forces to withdraw. It was then that the full scale of the disaster became apparent. Scouts rode north and returned with grim news. Custer and over 200 of his men were dead. The ridge where they fell was strewn with bodies, many stripped and mutilated in accordance with battle customs. Some were barely recognizable. The most haunting discovery was Custer himself. 2 bullets, one to the chest, one to the head. Some believed he had been killed in battle. Others whispered he had taken his own life rather than be captured. No one knew for sure. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over, but the shock was only beginning. The news of the defeat at Little Bighorn hit the United States like a thunderclap. On July 4, 1876, Americans had celebrated their centennial with parades and pageantry. Just 2 days later, they were grappling with the worst military disaster in decades. George Armstrong Custer, once the golden boy of the Republic, was dead. Public reaction was a volatile mix of grief, outrage, and disbelief. How could one of the country's most decorated war heroes fall to a group of savages in the wilderness? The answer, though complex, was buried under myth, ego, and strategic failure. Blame spread fast. Major Reno and Captain Benteen came under immediate scrutiny. Some accused them of cowardice for failing to support Custer in time. Others turned their ire on Custer himself, whose reckless disobedience of orders and refusal to wait for reinforcements had doomed the 7th Cavalry. The press had a field day. Some papers mourned a fallen hero. Others roasted Custer as arrogant and self-destructive. In the East, his death was romanticized, painted as a noble last stand. In the West, among the soldiers who had survived and the tribes who had fought, the view was far more grounded. For Native Americans, the battle was both victory and tragedy. It was proof they could win, but also a sign that worse would follow. And it did. The U.S. government responded with overwhelming force. The war intensified. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered a year later and was killed in captivity. Custer became legend, but the truth was more human and more haunting. He was a man who believed he was invincible, who chased legacy over strategy, and who underestimated the will of those he sought to conquer. His final act was not one of triumph, but of hubris, and it cost not only him, but hundreds of others, their lives. The fallout from Little Bighorn reshaped federal Indian policy. The sympathy and moral outrage briefly felt for the tribes evaporated. Now, the government had a rallying cry: vengeance. Military expeditions increased in size and frequency. Reservations were tightened. Native autonomy, already in decline, was brutally suppressed. Meanwhile, Custer's widow, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, began her lifelong mission of restoring and preserving his legacy. Through books, speeches, and interviews, she transformed the narrative, recasting Custer as a martyred hero, tragically betrayed. Her campaign succeeded. For decades, school children were taught of Custer's noble sacrifice, not his fatal miscalculations. In time, monuments were raised, books were written, paintings were commissioned. But the ground at Little Bighorn remembers more than just a battle. It remembers a nation's broken promises, a people's desperate stand, and the day when glory turned to ash.